Thank you very much. As you mentioned, my name is Chris, and this is my colleague Ryan, and we're both MASC students within the School of Engineering, and we study under the Water Resources Department. And coming up here, we're just kind of wrapping up our courses, so we'll be delving into river morphology and starting to analyze sediment transport and plant form changes and how those affect the rivers themselves, especially under large unsteady events. So a quick background, what is river morphology? I'm sure we all know here that rivers are not a static entity and that they change over time. But the way that they change is as a scientific kind of background to it. So as you can kind of see from the bottom graphic, as the rivers flow, the erosion part of the rivers come from the outside bends where we have faster water and kind of eats away from the banks. And as that soil and media and sediment is taken away from the outside banks, it's deposited onto the inside part of the flow path. So that's where you kind of see the deposition pans. And then eventually, over time, we get oxbow lakes where the outside curves are completely cut off. So while we analyze the morphology of the rivers, the large unsteady events, those often cause the largest changes to the actual plan and direction. So overall, the total analysis of the river over time, you can kind of look at how the shape and direction of the flow changes. Just kind of put into context as to why we need to study this is the 2013 Alberta floods. So I'm sure you guys can kind of remember the flooding of the Elbow and the Bow River caused a lot of damage to Canmore and downtown Calgary and even out to Medicine Hat. So the photo on the left here just kind of shows where the traditional river channel is and how far up the floodplain that flooding actually went and the damage that it caused to the downtown core. What's kind of interesting about this flood is that news media outlets kind of portrayed it as a large, like 100-year flood, and it's very rare. When in fact this flood is actually a 1 in 50, 1 in 70 type event, so it's actually a lot more common than what was reported. And the other graphic that's provided down at the bottom left is a flow hydrograph, so how much water is actually flowing through the river across the day. So you can see that there was a sudden and rapid increase kind of at the end of June, and it stayed up at a peak for over a week. This is what caused a lot of the extensive damage.
So when these large events happen, the paths of the rivers will change to be able to convey that large quantity of water more efficiently than the previous morphology. And one thing that was mentioned on that last slide is it had been more than 80 years since the last major flood had happened in Calgary. So over that time, the river had adjusted to much lower flow rates, and you can see on the left here, this was a stretch of the Elbow River upstream of Calgary before the flood. And you can see that the river is meandering a lot, so its path is it's not very straight, and you can see that there's lots of sharp curves throughout it. And when that large flood event happened, there was a lot more quantity of water than that previous geometry could convey. So the river sort of shifted and became a lot straighter, and there was a much straighter path that the river took after that large event as the sediment was redistributed around the channel. So on the right here, this shows basically the elevation changes that happened in that stretch of river over that flood. So there was the quantity of sediment that moved around was huge. And so some of these red areas that are highlighted there, the elevation actually increased by more than 5 meters. And some of the blue areas were eroded close to 5 meters as well. So there was a huge amount of morphology change and a lot of material that was moving because of the power of the flow during that flood. And so in the most extreme case, the river path actually shifted by more than 150 meters laterally. And so it's important to understand how the river paths change and how sediment is moved, because a lot of our infrastructure is dependent on that sediment for structural support. So there's some homes in Canmore that the path of the river shifted and really eroded away the sediment that was supporting their decks and the foundations of the houses, and really affected the structural integrity of those. And there's also a bridge in Calgary that collapsed days after the flood because a lot of the sediment that was around the bridge piers had eroded away. And so there was nothing to support the weight of the train as it went over. And that almost caused a large-scale chemical spill in the wake of that large flood.
So just into our research goals, what we hope to accomplish here at the University of Guelph. We're currently in the process of constructing a sand flume, which will provide us with a small scale ability to represent a sinuous channel and then run some of these magnified flow events through them to see how the system reacts. From the research and from the results of the study, we hope to develop some mathematical and mechanical equations. And this would be quite useful for development in some of the river modeling programs, such as HECRAS, which is just kind of shifty to unsteady flow events and requires a little bit more engagement. And finally, the last one is to fill in the knowledge gap. Although there's been plenty of research done in the last couple of decades on river morphology, little research has been completed on unconfined bed and banks during unsteady flows. And this is often the most difficult. It's unsteady banks and beds are what are in our natural environment. However, they're very difficult. And there's not a lot of cases of laboratory studies being completed on them. So we're hoping to kind of bridge the gap into there. So where does our flume stand today? The photo on the left is the current state of it. So we just got a liner in from Ohio. So we are in the process of getting the plumbing put in, some sand ordered. So hopefully by beginning of May, we'll be able to get it up and running and start completing some analysis. The graphic on the right is an AutoCAD depiction of the sinuous channel from a plan view. So as you can see, it goes through a couple sign cycles. So this will allow us to analyze a couple of different events and how it shifts across the sinuosity. And overall, the setup is similar to some of other gravel flume experiments completed at Queen's University in Colorado State.
And so part of the reason that we want to go with a laboratory scale experiment is that the natural river systems have many interactive processes, and it's really difficult to isolate one and to draw conclusions based on these complex systems. So by doing some lab experiments, we're able to isolate some parameters and make more concrete conclusions about a particular process. So we're looking mainly at sediment transport and the path changes. So the way that we're going to be testing that in the lab is we'll be running hydrographs of representing different storm events through the channel to see how it responds. So one thing that we're considering now is looking at how the hydrographs from either urban watersheds or rural watersheds could affect the morphology differently, since in urban environments there's usually more runoff and the peak flows occur faster due to all the impervious areas in the catchment. And so we'll be collecting the sediment at the outlet of our tank and measuring it at a certain time interval. And we'll also be monitoring the morphology changes using photogrammetry. So photogrammetry is basically using photos from a normal digital camera and running it through some analysis software to develop a digital elevation model, which is basically a 3D topography of the bed and the banks of the river. So basically the goal for us is we're going to take these morphology, or get the pictures of 3D morphology at regular intervals and be able to analyze how that morphology changes during those different types of storm events. And so for each time we want to get a complete picture of the bed, we'll probably need about at least 20 pictures of our bed to get an accurate model of the terrain. And so in conclusion, we think that our findings it'll help to predict the future changes of rivers and be able to predict the future path that they might take. And the main implications of this is that it will help designers and developers to understand where high-risk areas might be and where there might be an erosion hazard. And also, and to protect vulnerable infrastructure where it's needed. So in certain cases, you might want to reinforce banks to protect a certain building or other type of infrastructure. And thank you.